Okay, so this week we are going to look at the end of the Middle Kingdom and into the next phase of Egyptian history, which is the Second Intermediate Period. And it lasts for about 100 years. And we'll find some of the same things happening that happened in the First Intermediate Period, except in this case, for the second, weather doesn't seem to be an important factor here in terms of what's going on. And if you remember, we looked at some data from teeth that came from the First Intermediate Period, the Middle, and the Second Intermediate Period. And if you remember, it looks like food was not as scarce as it was during the First Intermediate Period. So there's some data that we looked at before, and just keep that in mind as we look through these slides. So here's a quote from a king who was living in Thebes. His name was Kamos. And I'll just read this really quickly to you. Why do I contemplate my strength while there is a great man in Avaris and another in Cush, sitting united with an Asiatic and a Nubian, while each man possesses his slice of Egypt? So what Kamos is talking about is that during the Second Intermediate Period, you've got these people called the Hyksos living in the north, and they're ruling over Egypt in the north. And then you've got the Nubians in the south. And, you know, we talked about the Nubians when we were looking at the Middle Kingdom in terms of how Egypt had invaded their area, built a lot of fortresses during the end of the Middle Kingdom and into the Second Intermediate Period. Egypt loses those fortresses, so Nubians gain control of those. And Kamos is the last king of the Second Intermediate Period, and he ushers in the next phase, which is the new kingdom. So we'll just talk a little bit about the process. So we do have some sources for the Second Intermediate Period. We've got kings lists, and some of them vary. Some of them don't show all of them, and some of them ignore the rulers in the north, the Hyksos rulers. There's some archaeology that we can look at, and in general, it's a difficult time for Egyptologists just because there's so many things going on and so much destruction happening. Now, here is a map taken from the atlas that I'm having you look at. And I've got an arrow here to the town or the city of Avaris, which we'll talk about. So some of the main reasons for the loss of the Middle Kingdom. One of the biggest is that there was a queen ruling at the end of the 12th dynasty, and she didn't have any children. So when that dynasty ended, there was a question of who was going to take over, and it caused quite a bit of issues. I mentioned this before for the Middle Kingdom, that there was an epidemic in the 13th dynasty, and that could have caused certainly some issues in terms of societal breakdown. Egypt loses Nubia. So remember, in the Middle Kingdom, there was a big push into that area and building of fortresses and so on. And then we've got these kingdoms in the Delta ruled by the Hyksos, and then they become rulers. So I also mentioned in the middle of the Dynasty 13, we've got the move from Ichtawe, which I talked about, and then Dynasty 13, the Egyptians moved their government to Thebes, which is in the south. And when they did that, they lost control of the north. Now, Avaris is one of the cities that was really built up during this time. And I mentioned this is where you've got all of these, quote, Asiatic people, or people from the north who aren't Egyptians coming in and living in Egypt. And it's interesting because if you look at the archaeological record, you find that a lot of the archaeology looks very different from Egyptian, and it's really Syro-Palestine or Syro-Palestine technology of these people. And so we can look at burials. When you look at the burials, they're very different from traditional Egyptian burials. There's weapons, there's animals, donkeys included in being buried. Sometimes they're buried within houses, which was not an Egyptian thing. And then we've got King Nessie from the 14th dynasty. He made Avaris his capital. And this was a fairly wealthy city because you get a lot of trade from the Mediterranean. So you've got, and this map doesn't quite show all the Mediterranean, but you've got the Palestinian Syria areas up here, and so on. And what you find is that these Hyksos rulers took Egyptian titles. So they wanted to become pharaoh. It looks like they didn't want to take over and make it sort of a Palestinian-Syrian area in terms of government. They wanted to be Egyptian. That's essentially what was happening. And then during the 15th dynasty, you've got the Hyksos taking over quite a bit of area. And I've got an arrow here where the city of Kusay is. So this is the area that the Hyksos ended up controlling in the second intermediate period. And then, you know, we talked about that, the fact that when the Middle Kingdom collapsed, the Egyptians lost control of Nubia. And if we look at Nubian archaeology during this time, we can see that some of the Egyptians stayed, and they're still doing trade with the Nubians, of course, and with the Hyksos, which is really interesting. We've got some material on the Kingdom of Kush. So this is the Nubian area and its capital, Kerma. However, they definitely built buildings, but what we'll talk about when we look at the New Kingdom is that during the New Kingdom, the Egyptians make a big push into Nubia again and then destroy a whole bunch of the Kerma or the Kush culture. And so a lot of the buildings are destroyed. So there's not a lot of archaeological evidence from this time. But what we do know is that this was sort of a high period for Nubia. So you've got large tombs, evidence of human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, a lot of cattle. And you know, if you remember, we talked about how Egypt used Nubia as sort of a gold mine. And so they were very wealthy. We know that despite the fact that they had taken over a chunk of southern Egypt, they were still doing trade with the Egyptians and with the Hyksos. So it's a pretty interesting time period. I just mentioned that the Egyptians moved to Thebes, and with that movement, they lost control of the north. They believed, and if you look at some of the kings list, they believed that they were continuing the Egyptian rule. Like a lot of this, you know, these intermediate periods, the chronology or what's happening is pretty difficult. You've got some archaeological evidence like shop tombs and so on. Now you've got this very unfortunate Egyptian ruler, Sennacherib Taha II. This is his mummified skull, and what you're looking at, and I'm going to have a special lecture just on him. He clearly died from wounds. Where he got these wounds, we'll talk about in that lecture. But what I'm doing is highlighting places in his face where he was hit by various objects, including having his nose sort of smashed in. We've got a primary text, which I won't talk about. I'll talk about in that special object lecture. But we do know that the Egyptians were fighting with the Hyksos at certain periods, and this pharaoh got involved in that. Now, I had mentioned that Kamose was a ruler in Thebes, and he is the one who gave that quote that I told you about at the very beginning. If you want to read another chunk of that, go ahead and stop the video. And then what we do know in terms of the end of the second intermediate period is that Kamose sailed north and he started to push out the Hyksos. What's really interesting and probably not surprising is that the Hyksos in the north asked the Nubians for help, hoping that it would take some pressure off them. Now what Kamose ended up doing is taking over Avaris and plundering the city. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of, there is archaeology, but not as much as we would hope for because of what he ended up doing to that city. And then what we find is that the next pharaoh, Ahmose, is technically considered to be the founder of the New Kingdom. And what Ahmose ended up doing is unifying Egypt once again, so taking control of the north, taking control of the south, and then that begins the next phase of Egyptian history, which is the New Kingdom.